Let us begin with a gentle but profound exploration of what it truly means to fall into a trap of ignorance, and ignorance not born of lack of intelligence, but a refusal to evolve. A stupid woman, in this context, is not defined by her intellect, but by her repeated embrace of patterns that hinder her growth. These patterns reveal themselves in subtle ways, quietly shaping her reality until she's ensnared by her own limitations. The first sign is emotional immaturity, a lack of self-awareness that leads to impulsive reactions rather than thoughtful responses. When a person refuses to reflect on their feelings or fails to understand how their emotions affect others, they become ruled by fleeting desires and whims. Rather than navigating life with calm wisdom, they find themselves controlled by every storm that arises within them. It's like being tossed about on the ocean without a rudder. Emotional immaturity prevents growth because it locks a person in the realm of reaction, never allowing them to experience the peace that arises from reflection and understanding. The second sign is an unhealthy dependence on external validation. There is nothing inherently wrong with seeking approval. After all, we are social beings. But when a woman becomes consumed by the need to be validated by others, whether through social media, appearances, or constant attention, she loses her sense of self. This creates a hollow life, one where her identity is fragile and built on the shifting sands of public opinion. Such dependency erodes true confidence, leaving only the shallow pursuit of fleeting praise. Avoidance of personal responsibility is the third sign. Blame becomes her shield, and excuses her sword. When life presents challenges, she chooses to cast herself as the eternal victim, never pausing to ask what role she might have played in her circumstances. This mindset, while comforting in the short term, is ultimately a prison. True growth demands that we take responsibility for our lives, not with guilt or shame, but with the quiet understanding that we are both the problem and the solution. Those who refuse to embrace this truth become trapped in cycles of helplessness. The fourth sign is a fixation on superficiality, on appearances, material possessions, and status symbols. A woman consumed by this mindset loses the deeper experience of life. She might pursue luxury and admiration, mistaking them for meaning. But a life built on the pursuit of external beauty and material wealth will always feel incomplete. There is a vast world beneath the surface of life, rich in meaning, connection, and depth. But the woman who remains stuck in superficial pursuits will never experience its fullness. Then there is the desire to control others while refusing to engage in self-reflection. This is the fifth sign, a subtle but dangerous one. Instead of working on her own growth, she seeks to manipulate and mold the world around her to fit her comfort. Relationships become power struggles, and every interaction feels like a test of dominance. But control is an illusion, a game that leaves her more isolated and exhausted than empowered. True strength lies in mastering oneself, not in bending others to your will. The sixth and final sign is the resistance to change, a stubborn refusal to adapt, evolve, or expand her mind. Change is the only constant in life, but for those who resist it, life becomes a repetitive loop. Ideas grow stale, perspectives narrow, and curiosity fades into complacency. Such resistance stifles growth and prevents the wisdom that comes with embracing the unknown. It creates a life that feels safe on the surface but hollow beneath it. Each of these signs, taken alone, might seem harmless, but together they form a pattern that limits a woman's potential, robbing her of the chance to experience life in its fullness. These are not traits to condemn, but signals that invite reflection and transformation. When noticed and confronted, they can become powerful lessons, guiding anyone who sees them toward a more expansive, authentic way of living. The key is to remain awake, curious, and open to change. Only then can these limitations be transcended, turning obstacles into the very steps that lead to freedom. Emotional immaturity and lack of self-awareness often manifest in ways that can disrupt personal growth and relationships. It begins with the inability to recognize and regulate emotions, causing a person to be ruled by impulses rather than thoughtful responses. This lack of emotional regulation leads to frequent outbursts, irrational behavior, and a tendency to react without fully understanding the situation or the consequences of their actions. Such impulsive tendencies create patterns of instability and leave others around them walking on eggshells. Without self-awareness, the individual struggles to reflect on their feelings or motivations. Instead of asking why certain emotions arise or how they impact their decisions, they blame external factors for their internal state. This inability to look inward prevents growth and fosters a sense of victimhood. Relationships suffer because communication is often one-sided, driven by emotions rather than understanding or compromise. The person becomes trapped in cycles of conflict, unable to see how their own behavior contributes to the problems they face. Emotional immaturity also manifests in the avoidance of responsibility. Difficult emotions such as guilt, shame, or disappointment are deflected rather than processed. The person may project blame onto others, refusing to acknowledge their part in creating or sustaining negative situations. This denial of responsibility can make it nearly impossible to learn from mistakes or grow beyond current limitations. Instead of adapting, they remain stuck in familiar patterns, repeating the same mistakes while expecting different results. The lack of self-awareness extends to an inability to recognize personal triggers and emotional blind spots. When confronted with uncomfortable truths, the emotionally immature person becomes defensive or dismissive. They might respond with anger, sarcasm, or avoidance, shielding themselves from the discomfort of self-reflection. This defensive posture creates a barrier between them and deeper connections with others. It stifles honest conversations and keeps them locked in shallow interactions that never address underlying issues. Emotional immaturity often leads to a deep need for validation from others. Without a solid sense of self, the individual relies on external approval to feel worthy. This dependence makes them vulnerable to manipulation and leaves them constantly seeking reassurance. When validation is not received, feelings of inadequacy and insecurity surface. Instead of addressing these insecurities, they may lash out or withdraw, further isolating themselves from meaningful relationships and personal growth opportunities. This lack of self-awareness also manifests in poor decision-making. Choices are made based on immediate emotional gratification rather than long-term thinking. Short-sighted decisions often lead to regret and frustration, but without self-reflection, the patterns repeat. The emotionally immature person rarely stops to analyze why certain decisions backfire or how they could approach similar situations differently in the future. This cycle of impulsivity and regret becomes a defining feature of their life. Another hallmark of emotional immaturity is an inability to handle criticism. Feedback, even when offered constructively, is perceived as an attack. Rather than seeing criticism as an opportunity to learn and improve, the individual becomes defensive, deflecting blame or rationalizing their actions. This resistance to feedback limits personal development and leaves the person stuck in the same patterns of behavior. They miss out on valuable insights that could help them grow and evolve. Emotional immaturity often coexists with a fear of vulnerability. The person may build emotional walls to protect themselves from being hurt, but these walls also prevent genuine connection. They avoid deep conversations or emotional intimacy, opting for surface-level interactions that feel safer. Over time, this fear of vulnerability creates feelings of loneliness and disconnection, even in relationships that appear stable on the surface. It's a self-imposed prison that reinforces isolation rather than fostering connection. The inability to empathize with others is another symptom of emotional immaturity and lack of self-awareness. When someone lacks empathy, they struggle to see situations from another person's perspective. This limits their ability to form deep, meaningful relationships. Their interactions become transactional, focused on their own needs and desires without considering how their actions affect those around them. Over time, this self-centered approach erodes trust and alienates others. Emotionally immature individuals are often driven by a need for control. When life feels chaotic or overwhelming, they attempt to micromanage situations and people to regain a sense of stability. This need for control stems from deep-seated insecurity and fear of the unknown. Instead of adapting to change and uncertainty, they resist it, trying to force life into predictable patterns. This resistance to change ultimately limits their growth and prevents them from experiencing the full richness of life's possibilities. A lack of emotional maturity also affects how individuals process conflict. Rather than addressing issues calmly and constructively, they resort to avoidance, passive aggressiveness, or outright aggression. These maladaptive strategies prevent resolution and often escalate the conflict further. Over time, unresolved conflicts accumulate, creating a toxic environment in personal and professional relationships. The emotionally immature person may convince themselves that others are always to blame, further deepening their sense of victimhood. Finally, emotional immaturity leads to an unstable sense of identity. Without self-awareness, the individual remains disconnected from their true values and desires. They are easily influenced by external forces, adopting beliefs, behaviors, and goals that don't truly align with who they are. This lack of alignment creates an underlying sense of dissatisfaction and restlessness. The pursuit of external success or validation fails to fill the void, leaving the individual constantly searching for something they cannot define. Avoidance of personal responsibility often begins with a refusal to confront one's own role in the challenges and struggles they face. It's easier to point fingers at external circumstances or blame others than to acknowledge personal shortcomings. This mindset creates a distorted reality where accountability is seen as a burden rather than a tool for growth. The person becomes trapped in a cycle of excuses, each one reinforcing the belief that life is happening to them rather than being shaped by their actions and choices. This pattern leads to a victim mentality where life feels unfair and every setback is attributed to forces beyond their control. In this mental framework, the individual absolves themselves of any obligation to take corrective action. Problems become permanent and solutions are rarely sought because doing so would require admitting fault or weakness. Instead of learning from mistakes, they become stuck in an endless loop of repeating them while blaming others for the consequences.